Let's start off with how the last devlog ended. So I mentioned that the game was having an identity crisis. There was something fun about the fast movement system that clashed with the original game design. If you haven't watched the first devlog, I'd recommend checking it out for some context. I have a solution that seems to work for now. All of the solutions I came up with seem to have me rattling my brain for how this would work with X, Y, and Z. My solution is make the original game idea a mission type rather than the sole game. So previously I mentioned carrying this bag of treasures with you really slowly might become tedious, and that the fast movement was quite fun. The closest to this original idea would be to have a creature that you would give resources to, and this creature you would have to use your ropes to bring it along with you, and if you left it on its own for too long, it would get scared and scurry back to its original position, and all the treasures you'd given it would go back to their original positions. So this would be a strategy where you have to keep this creature with you, move it along, and if you run off to get treasure without bringing it, if you're not quick enough, it disappears and then you have to get those treasures again. In a similar way, I had an idea for a static deposit point. So this one, you would need to bring several items to it to either get an item, unlock a door, or something like that. And this one, you would have a time limit to do it. So rather than the bag idea where it's about how do I smartly traverse and keep this thing around, it would instead be how quickly can I get the parts that I need before they again return to where they came from. So this would give you a divide of the slow methodical traversal and then quick as you can get the stuff to the point. So these would be quite different, but the end goal is the same. So I could add more missions. This is just what I thought of at the time to sort of replace the original idea and allow me to experiment with more stuff. But yeah, there could be more mission types. It's just 2 that I've got at the minute. So moving on to actual development, similar to last time, I'm just going to run through this week's development. So we're talking about bugs, design process, and new features. So the first thing I did was squash and stretch. Now this is quite a common animation principle. So you've probably seen a lot of animations where you have a ball that drops, and as it's doing so, it will stretch, and when it hits the ground, it will squash. So it's quite a cartoony thing, but I wanted to apply it to the game just to see what it would look like, and I did a little post with this as well on Instagram. So I had a rough idea how squash and stretch might work in Unity, but I decided to watch a tutorial, so I'll link that down below. So I quite like how this turned out. It definitely took a lot of tweaking, so there were times where the stretch would be too big, I'd have to mess with scales, or it would take too long to animate, and it would kind of seem like you were still in your squash animation by the time you were ready to jump again into your stretch. So I tried to make these quite minimal in time, so it's kind of a more subtle effect. So next I went and changed how I'm creating levels. So when I originally studied a games course, there weren't too many 2D features, and I kind of missed out on tile maps. At least they weren't super common when I was doing that course. I wanted to increase my knowledge of these newer tools, so I decided to take a look at tile maps. The tile map system allows you to use tile palettes to draw directly onto your scenes to create levels, and you can do this pretty fast. You can add colliders to these, you can change the layer they appear on, so whether it's background, foreground, or whatever you want. And you can also set up rule tiles, which means that you can have defined logic for if you have 2 tiles together, what does the tile next to them turn into. So this is for, if you think of like curved platforms, you might want like a corner piece and a bottom piece, and it will just do that for you. I've not messed with the rules yet, but I have messed with the tile palettes. Another reason I added this is because it allows for sprite art to scale properly, so I wouldn't have to mess with like infinite tiling or anything like that. In the previous week's footage you probably saw that the ground texture was stretched. That's because it was just a quick way of mocking stuff up, so I just attached it to an object, scaled the object, and then boom, I had a floor. So that is changed with tile maps because I can just draw a floor and it's individual sprites per tile, so no stretch issues at all. Since I could easily change the level, I decided to mix up my prototype level, just because it was 10 times easier to prototype. I added some static grass as well, just to give it some more flair. I then discovered several bugs. First up, you just randomly get caught on something while you were moving, and I looked in edit mode to see what collisions were going on with colliders, and it didn't really make much sense. But I was using a box collider, so I changed that over to a capsule collider, and the issue seemed to disappear. So after I did the capsule collider, like I said, it was fixed. But if you ran fast, you would kind of jump up a little bit, and I'm guessing that's where it was getting stuck before. So I randomly had the thought of, can you throw an object inside another object? Because when you pick up an object, its collider is essentially turned off until you throw it. So I experimented for a while, jumping and trying to throw the different objects into the ceiling, and sure enough you can do it and get an object stuck. Interestingly, you can retrieve the object, so it's not permanently stuck there, but it's something that I want to keep in mind and try and come up with a way how to fix. Strangely as well, I found an issue where if a triangle lands on your head, it just infinitely rotates, which is fine, I guess. So next up, I added a animation frame for holding an item while you're stood still. So before, if you were running and holding an item, it would look fine. If you stopped for a second, you'd be stood there and it'd just be floating above your head. So that's been addressed, and I think it looks a lot better for it. The only thing to do with this is that because I've added squash and stretch, and the item you're carrying doesn't squash and stretch, it's a little bit weird, but I'm not sure if that matters. So I could probably fix it, but I'm just not sure if it would look right doing squash and stretch if you're holding the item that's not hitting the ground directly and stuff. I'm not too sure. Next up, I did some research into flattening grass in 2D. Most of the posts I read said that if you give your grass colliders, then you've got a lot of objects with colliders and it will give you a lot of performance overhead. So they basically said shaders is the way to go. So I looked at shader graph and did a couple tutorials. So just as a test, I decided to mess with these on a player sprite and see what kind of stuff would happen. So first of all, I completely screwed the alpha channel and I ended up making this really chonky looking player. He is quite flat and quite squish. So I actually fixed it while I was recording that chonky clip, so this is the fix if anyone has that issue. Next up, I had a dissolve shader on the player, which looks pretty cool. Not really what I need for grass, but whatever, it was a tutorial. Next up, I had a wind effect on the player, which looks pretty strange, but I quickly applied this to the grass and tweaked the settings so it was more of a subtle effect, and I think it looks quite good. As for flattening grass, the examples I looked at mentioned tracking the player position and then using that to change how the grass looks is the best way through a shader, but because my game is in 2D and you can always see everything around you, it would be expected for any other moving object to do the same thing, and there can essentially be an infinite number of objects. So either I need to keep track of multiple objects and deal with the nearest one, or I need to come up with another system. I did try and do the physics thing, just thinking that I could manage the amount of grass within the level, but it kind of had a bit of a weird spring effect, and it might be because I'm not changing the sprite, I'm just like flattening the grass and stuff, but it didn't seem too good, so I just scrapped it in the end. So I came across a bug which would probably be pretty cool for speedrunning, but probably wants fixing. So when you reel the rope in, it deletes the nodes in between the first and last node. So that's the one attached to your player and the one that you're attaching to an object. So anything in between gets deleted, and then the nodes will come closer together. So the issue with this is if you do the fast reel, it basically deletes all the middle nodes, and the middle nodes are doing the collision. So if you delete those and your top node and bottom node are basically above and below a ground block, it doesn't care if the rope would go through it sideways. So there's some footage here that probably explains what I'm talking about. There is collision on the actual line that the line renderer is producing, but because the position of the joints and the line being drawn happens before the collision, because it needs to know what it's drawing, it's always too late, so it's kind of a pointless collider unless the rope is stationary. So I'm not really sure how to fix this. I could try and make it so each node has to get close enough to the previous node before it deletes, but I don't know how good that will be. So another option is if you're not attached to an object and you do fast reel, just go through the floor, because it doesn't really matter, you're not pulling anything, there's nothing that you're glitching through that could exploit anything. So it'd be kind of similar to how if you left click it just deletes the whole rope. Let me know if you have any ideas on ways of fixing this problem. I then added the grapple sprite to the end of the rope, which was long overdue. The art had been done for a while. No emotes yet, even though there is art for that. I did have some difficulties trying to get it to face the right direction, because I tried things like linking it to the hinge, and the hinge always seems to rotate, so it wasn't really working how I wanted it to. So I kind of got this working, but when you did fast reel, the rope head would just spin around constantly, and it kind of had this cool reeling effect as if someone was like turning a crank that was moving the rope, but ultimately it's not what I had in mind. So what I did is I looked at the node position next to the grappling hook and worked out the angle between those two and set the rotation of the grapple hook to represent that, and it seems to work pretty well. I then added some frames for swinging forwards and backwards. There's no jump animation yet or fall animation or anything like that, so kind of looks a little bit weird. It's only a single frame for each direction, so maybe it wouldn't look as weird if he was like dangling his feet back and forth or moving the position of his hands or something, but it's something, and it's kind of set up to be there for the future. Although my animator is looking quite messy now, so I might need to swap to an option that just changes the sprites in code rather than using the animator, because this just doesn't look good and it's not that manageable. So I left my PC on, went for a shower, watched some YouTube, etc, etc, and I came back and the game was completely screwed. And I don't mean like I deleted it or anything weird like that, but if you leave the player hanging on a rope for a while, the physics will just glitch out. And I don't know if this is a Unity problem or this is a problem with my physics particularly, but I'm guessing there's some infinite rotation going on or something weird with the node positions. So I came back and the rope was separate from where the player was hanging. So you can see in this bad footage that the player's hanging around and it's just glitching out. The second time this happened to me, I decided to get proper footage of it, so you can kind of see it like glitching out on the floor here. But it wasn't as crazy as the time when I caught it with my phone camera. I decided I want to try and fix this issue, so I left the game running for 40 minutes and I got some interesting results. After about 3 to 5 minutes, there's some shaking that I think any player would notice, but they're probably not going to be leaving it hanging for 3 to 5 minutes. It does suggest an underlying problem though. At about 15 minutes it gets more screwed. At around 30 minutes, who even knows what's going on? Once I got back to my PC, I went in edit mode to see what was going on, and it looks like the rope nodes were getting stuck at certain intervals. So normally the nodes make up the whole length of the rope evenly, but they'd kind of divided themselves up into groups and decided to overlap one another. So I tried messing with this to see if I could fix it at runtime and mess with some of the physics settings. So I turned off things like, I made it so that the rope nodes can collide with each other, I changed the rigid body types, all this kind of stuff, and I got this weird effect, and no idea how to fix this, but it's something. Before I get into the final change, there are some tidbits that I noticed this week. So you couldn't jump on the throwable objects before, so I basically made it so the default layer and some that I've specified allow you to jump on them, and then ones that I've just denied you can't jump on. I did make it a little bit easier to jump on slopes. I think this is an effect of changing to a capsule collider, but it's still a problem where if you stand on a slope you slip off it, and that doesn't sound too bad, but if you have the slightest incline you will slip off it, and the only way to really make it is to jump the whole thing or try and jump immediately, and it should probably keep you stationary with slight inclines, and I'm not too sure how to fix this. Maybe something to do with the physics material. Finally, I decided I didn't want to put a devlog out there without having some big visual change, both for a thumbnail and to keep things interesting. So I decided to make some background tiles. So I made some stone looking stuff and some dirt background. So I added all that into the game, and it's quite nice because you could just drag all the tiles across now. I didn't have to mess around resizing stuff, and I had a lot more freedom to design the background than if I'd done it the old-fashioned way. So I really wanted to show off these background tiles and how they would interact with lighting, so I added some torch sprites and put them in the foreground, and I think it looks quite nice. So I'm quite happy with how the game's looking at the minute. I don't know if these devlogs will stay weekly because it depends on how much content gets done and if I want to keep anything secret and not spoil it. And yes, I did play more Space Engineers this time. But yeah, if you want to stay up to date, stay tuned, and I'll be uploading more devlogs going forward.